At this point, you should have read Shirobelowski's chapter on simile and metaphor, so some of this is going to be review, but I do want to add some to what Wolowski has to say, particularly about metaphor. I think this is a particularly important part of poetic language, and I think it's worth taking some time to think through what exactly is happening with a metaphor. So you'll recall that a simile is a comparison that is explicit. Usually it uses the word like or as to call your attention to the comparison that is happening. Let's look at one example, and the examples that I'm going to use in this little talk are all from Langston Hughes, a poet who we'll read later in the semester. You can see here that Langston Hughes writes, "I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa." We're going to focus really on these second two lines, where you can see that he is describing the ways in which he thinks of himself as black, and he really calls our attention to that by using the word as here and the word like. So two similes that are very explicit in saying here are the things that I am comparing to each other. A metaphor, in contrast, and this may be a different definition than what Wolowski gives. This is from the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. They define a metaphor as a figure of speech, quote, in which a word or phrase is shifted from its normal uses to a context where it evokes new meaning. I want to explore that a little bit, because usually when we talk about a metaphor, if I ask students at the beginning of a class on metaphor to define it, they describe it as a comparison. And yet, this definition doesn't really use that word, and I think that's worth giving some thought to. So let's look at an example from Langston Hughes. This is actually an entire poem. It's only 4 lines. "That justice is a blind goddess is a thing to which we blacks are wise. Her bandage hides 2 festering sores that once, perhaps, were eyes." And I think you can look at this as an extended metaphor, and we can begin with this first sentence, this first pair. Well, what is this poem about? It's about justice. And in a traditional way of thinking about a metaphor, we would say that Hughes is comparing justice to a blind goddess, and there's a certain sense in which that is true. If we go back to this definition from the Princeton Encyclopedia, though, what we might say is that Hughes is asking us as readers to transfer some, at least, of what we think about a blind goddess to this concept of justice, and that we will get new meaning from that. Hughes, of course, is well aware that we as readers can transfer quite a bit of meaning if we wish to, so he gives us a little bit of guidance here. Her bandage hides 2 festering sores that once perhaps were eyes, calling our attention to the absence of sight, the way in which justice, this blind goddess, fails to see and to understand what it means to be black. So Hughes limits what we can and cannot transfer by giving us this second sentence. But overall, a powerful figure of speech here that really says something about the way in which Hughes understands and experiences justice. This idea of transference is actually built into the word metaphor. It's from the Greek word that means to transfer. But this idea is really explored by Aristotle, who gives us a lot of this thought about how a metaphor is transferring the meaning from one context into a new context to create new meaning. Now, one of the debates about metaphor that you should be aware of is that over the years, scholars have debated whether metaphor actually is decorative. Is it simply an embellishment in language, or does it actually contribute to meaning in a significant way? And a set of terms that I want to use in this class that gets at this comes from the writer I.A. Richards. He was very interested in making the argument that metaphor actually creates meaning. So he introduces a new set of terms, and I think they're a very useful set of terms in talking about metaphor. He begins with the term tenor and says this is the thing that is being described. And then he also talks about the vehicle, the other part of the metaphor, the thing or the idea in terms of which the tenor is described. So let's go back to our example from Hughes. What is the tenor in this metaphor? What is the vehicle? Well, we've already said the thing that is being described is justice. So justice, I'm going to put a T here, is the tenor of the metaphor. What is the vehicle? What is the thing that is used to help us better understand justice? Well, that would be the blind goddess. This becomes the vehicle for the metaphor. We'll spend some more time talking about these terms and why they're important. But I think one of the key ideas here to pull from Richards and his use of this new terminology is that this is not just decoration, but when we take this vehicle and apply it here, we create a new meaning. It's not just making the language a little bit prettier. So a few things to think about with this discussion of metaphor. There's some things that I want you to think about. Which is a more powerful figure of speech, a simile or a metaphor, and why? Second question, how much meaning do we transfer? And who controls that? You think about the structure of a metaphor. If we say, my love is like a red, red rose, a famous metaphor, that's actually a simile. Let's change it. Let's make it a metaphor. My love is a red rose. Well, how much of that idea from the red rose do we transfer to the love? Certain parts of it work. On the other hand, if we say that flower is a rose, well, then we transfer nearly all of the meaning because it's a literal statement and no longer a metaphor. So you can see that there are degrees to which we transfer meaning. And a question worth considering is who decides how much we transfer? A third question for you to think about, what causes metaphors to fail? I'm sure you've all experienced it when someone tries to use a metaphor and it just doesn't work. So what causes that? These are some of the questions that we'll come back to in class when we turn to some discussion of done and of metaphor.